one of the most fascinating and arguably the most complex and disappointing issues in all of the tobacco conundrum is the issue of religion in tobacco. And in reviewing the collection of the Center for the Study of Tobacco and Society, one comes away with some clear, no-brainer kinds of points that don't seem to be made very often, namely that there were groups that unsung were always opposed to smoking and didn't trumpet this, simply considered this part of their religion and part of life. And most notably, that would be the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which in the 1950s created the first stop smoking programs, the 5-day stop smoking program. And the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Latter-day Saints or Mormons, Pentecostal, Muslim, and other groups that simply advocated abstinence, not as a matter of broadcasting, but as a matter of just what their basic beliefs were. It's the other religions that really have, I think, been shameful for the most part in this. I mean, the Southern Baptists did come out in the early 1980s and suggested that tobacco farmers should be getting into other things. But even before that, the North Carolina Council on Churches, a Methodist group, was examining what they called North Carolina's tobacco dilemma, namely raising a great percentage of the nation's tobacco crops, a big economic boon to the state, while also causing enormous death, disease, and suffering. So it's really a kind of complex issue, but if we go through it, we'll see some of the stories and some of the real needless tragedies, I think, that could have been prevented. There are some unsung heroes. Father Mike Crosby, a Jesuit priest who has led the effort to go to shareholders' meetings of tobacco companies and, of course, many other kinds of companies, not just those related to tobacco, and produce resolutions that would call upon the companies to stop targeting their advertising to children, or to take a look at tobacco growing and the employment of children, and above all, to begin to phase out and look at other products and so forth. And as Mike said, we've been to about 20 Philip Morris meetings together, but he started going in 83. My first meeting was in 85 or 86. And Mike said, we don't expect to win, but we don't expect to stop doing this either. So I think the good news is he's not going to quit. And the problem is, where are all the other groups that should be supporting him? The magazine Mother Jones did do an expose on the Christian Coalition and pointed out the disparity between Pat Robertson, who as a minister railed against smoking, but wouldn't really raise a finger to block his chief operating officer, Ralph Reed, the head of the Christian Coalition's day-to-day operations, who basically ridiculed and disparaged the effort to counteract smoking and try to liken it to Clinton's efforts. So you have a Republican ideologue named Ralph Reed, who I guess later on sustained his own corrupt difficulties, and Pat Robertson, sincere though he might be, who never really did clamp down on the coalition to actually practice what they preached in terms of not smoking. The biggest hypocrisy really is that of Judaism, where you have benefactors paying the way for a lot of Jewish organizations whose silence on this elemental health issue was effectively bought. And that includes organizations like Hadassah, which took cigarette advertisements, and then when they finally dropped cigarette ads in the early 1990s, I believe, they trumpeted this as some kind of wonderful breakthrough, as so many of the organizations do when they finally see it the right way and they put their finger up to the wind and they realize they're no longer in the silent majority. They're in the minority of people, and they've done the wrong thing. This Alan Tygay, the editor, a buffoon really, who defended cigarette advertising in Hadassah magazine, 3 to 5 ads per issue from Reynolds and Lowe's, as saying, well, the government has put the Surgeon General's warning on it, and that's about all you need, and people have a right to choose for themselves. And this is what we heard from all sorts of institutions. And it really wasn't until Henry and Edith Everett two Jewish philanthropists in New York City, challenged the growing philanthropic might of the Tisch family, the owners of Lowe's or Lorillard. I mean, gosh, to have a hospital, Tisch Hospital, named after them. I mean, or the Tisch Cancer Institute at Mount Sinai. This is the kind of disgrace that it's really laughable. I guess you could go back to the Duke family and the endowment of Duke, and through that the Methodist Church in North Carolina, all from tobacco, and Bowman Gray for R.J. Reynolds and the hospitals affiliated with that medical school. But really in New York, which purports to have a more enlightened progressive viewpoint, to have the leading Jewish philanthropist being a cigarette executive is despicable. And in spite of Henry Everett's efforts to call attention to Tisch, let's face it, they were philanthropic rivals, but beyond that, Henry made his income not in cigarettes, but in the stock market and investments. And to call attention to this by means of ads and press releases that we helped him send out to the various news media. He didn't win these battles, and in fact, the New York Times columnist Clyde Haberman wrote a column that pretty much said, well, everybody's got to choose his own morality. Although, in fairness, in 1997, Haberman did present all sides of the issue. I think that Tisch and the Tisch family was basically all-powerful in New York, and no one was willing to question this, and people were willing to rationalize everything they did. Most despicably, The Forward, which is the weekly newspaper that was revived and with the age-old Yiddish name, The Forward, from over 100 years before. And the editorial that they wrote when Henry Everett challenged the Tisches was truly as underhanded as I think I've ever read, basically saying that Everett's motivation was because he was a board member of a rival another Jewish newspaper, turned out to be a rival to The Forward, and that when Everett opposed Tisch's nomination to head the United Jewish Appeal, the biggest Jewish charity in New York, that this was also really due to the fact that the Jewish Week was a major recipient of the UJA, and this could jeopardize their funding for the newspaper that Everett was involved in. It was convoluted reasoning, but The Forward has never acknowledged the Tisch family's horrible contribution to death and disease in this society, nor have most other organizations. Bill Cahan, the nephew of Abe Cahan, the founder of The Forward, wrote a letter to John Bradamus that was published in a journal, and in which he challenged Bradamus to turn down the Tisch money and not to rename the hospital the Tisch Hospital. And these pleas were ignored. So you have a leading New York hospital named after a cigarette magnate, and this goes along with the one-time head of R.J. Reynolds, who engineered the biggest leverage buyout in history, having his name put on the Mount Sinai main building. But there you have it, the disproportionate number of executives of the tobacco industry who are Jewish. George Weissman, the prominent executive for Philip Morris, who became president, and then he became chairman of Lincoln Center and wielding all the power of the arts. Philip Morris being, of course, the leading corporate funder of the arts, with $15 million a year of Philip Morris tobacco money funding arts organizations and silencing them from speaking out. I think that the Marlboro Country Music Festival was also held at Lincoln Center, among many, many other events, opera, ballet, and theater events, all sponsored by Philip Morris. But you have really the Cullman family, the owners of Philip Morris, the longtime owners of Philip Morris, essentially one of the leading Jewish families of New York, and then the Tisch family and the Weissmans and so forth. And this came all to my attention in the early 1980s when I noticed in the publication, the United States Tobacco and Candy Journal, the ads for the United Jewish Appeal and the National Conference of Christians and Jews, the Anti-Defamation League, and their annual dinner and their Americanism Award. In one year, they gave it to Horace Cornegie, who was the head of the Tobacco Institute. And they gave an award to the James Bowling, the president of Philip Morris. These are the kinds of ads that came to my attention, and I called these folks, and we wrote this up in an article in the New York State Journal of Medicine called How Tobacco Companies Have Found Religion. I was assisted by a freelance writer, Kate Fitzgerald, formerly of the San Diego Tribune. And one by one, all these organizations said, well, we're the tobacco industry branch of the National Conference on Christians and Jews, and we hold a dinner every year, and we always give an award to a member of the tobacco industry. And again, the same thing about the Surgeon General. That's what he wants to do, and we do our own award. This did not go unnoticed by other people. Bernice Kleiman, a longtime member of Hadassah in San Diego, wrote in many letters to Hadassah magazine as early as 1977, calling attention to the hypocrisy of Hadassah, which was, after all, largely a Jewish humanitarian organization raising money for the Hadassah Health Center in Israel, having all these cigarette ads in its publication. But there you have it. You really just see that money talks. Over the years, Doc tried to call attention to it. We took out an ad in the Jewish Herald Voice in Russian, perhaps the only Russian anti-smoking ad in the United States, because there were a lot of Russian immigrants, Jewish immigrants in Houston. And it was just a simple no smoking sign and some Russian language that we got some assistance on from Alex Prokhorov, a researcher in Houston. But it was perhaps the first paid ad. But our more famous one was the ad that said in the Jewish Week, Meshuggah or not Meshuggah? Are we crazy? Or did we see in the Jewish Week an advertisement by tobacco giant Philip Morris Companies that questions whether the Environmental Protection Agency's report on secondhand smoke is all that it's cracked up to be? You'd expect a tobacco company to protest the scientific evidence confirming the devastating health effects of cigarettes in smokers and non-smokers alike. But who is naive enough to believe the chutzpah of an industry whose products are responsible for more than 430,000 deaths each year in the U.S. and 3 million deaths annually worldwide? Enough is enough. It's time for organizations like the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, the National Conference of Christians and Jews, the American Jewish Committee, to live up to their religious ethics and stop honoring tobacco company executives with awards and praise. And given the high standing of the medical profession within the Jewish community, it's time for Jewish publications to stop helping Philip Morris and the other tobacco industry merchants of death create a smokescreen to cover up the lethal truth about cigarettes. And we put at the bottom, Shlemiel, those who blow smoke at the public, and Shlemazel on the other side of the yin-yang sign that Philip Morris created to have equal respect for all. That was their non-smoking and smoking accommodation campaign they ran beginning in the 96 Olympics that ran the week before in the Jewish Week. And on the other side of Shlemiel, those who blow smoke at the public, was Shlemazel, those who have smoke blown in their face. And we took the ad out and got some fair attention, a nice editorial in the Houston Chronicle saying anti-smoking ad on Target. So really the whole nature of religion and tobacco is a sad one. There's all sorts of biblical interpretations, but clearly Jewish ethics says that the body is a temple, and take heed to thyself and take care of thy life in Deuteronomy. Take good care of your lives in Deuteronomy. The other side was God protects all fools, or the basic, I think the basic line also from Deuteronomy was never put an obstacle in front of a blind man. And I think that's what we really should have had prevail, namely working to protect people who might not have been as aware of smoking and not having these terrible obstacles of cigarette advertising thrown in their path. over the years, I did have an occasion to talk to one individual who was very closely tied with the United States Tobacco Company, Father Martin. Father Joseph Martin had suffered from alcoholism, as had the president of U.S. Tobacco, Lou Bantle. And Bantle became very close to Martin. And at one congressional hearing, he actually got Martin to testify in behalf of United States Tobacco. And I called Father Martin and got him on the phone and asked him whether he had ever thought about his testimony in favor of tobacco company. And he was very nice, very cordial. He said he really hadn't thought about it. He hadn't thought that smokeless tobacco was very harmful. But he was cordial to me. He did pause a long time and reflected on it and wished me well. Another priest in Brooklyn who was known for singing If I Were a Rich Man at tobacco-funded Catholic Charities dinners was Father Joseph Finaro, and he was very thoughtful when we called him as well and said maybe he should have thought more about this. But all in all, a rather dismal picture where, except for the Seventh-day Adventists and people like Henry Everett and Edith Everett, and in the 1990s, some coalitions on religion and health, and then, of course, the North Carolina Council of Churches in the 1980s, and the Southern Baptist, you could say, in the 1980s. But really, the outspokenness was not there. The Seventh-day Adventists are just too kind and too polite to go crusading and proselytizing, but there they were all the time, diligently living that lifestyle. And I guess it's best summed up by the story of the Mother Superior of the Catholic Diocese in Salt Lake City. That the story was told to me by Harry Short, who was the health commissioner of Salt Lake City, who knew the Mother Superior back in the early 1980s before there was non-smoking on airplanes. And this a nun was in her habit, and she was sitting down on a plane, and then a fellow came by and sat next to her. And during the flight, he said, "Do you mind if I smoke?" And she said, "Well, personally, I do. I think it's really terrible, and you really shouldn't do it, and I find it objectionable." And he just stared at her and looked and said, "Well, you damn Mormons are all alike."